Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted, and welcome to part 2 of our lecture regarding war and exclusion. Now, we left off talking about the causes and the kind of carrying out of the Mexican Revolution, especially as the U.S. intervention part of that. But all this decade-long fighting, bloody fighting, and U.S. intervention had a tremendous impact on U.S. Mexicanos. And what it did, it was reinforce some negative Mexican immigrant stereotypes, where Anglo-Americans believed all Mexicans to be radicals, espousing revolutionary sentiment against the U.S. government. In other words, these were dangerous, violent revolutionaries crossing the border. Now, to be clear, there was some evidence of this. Take, for example, Francisco Madero. We talked about him briefly last time. He was the first real president of Mexico in more than 30 years when he ousted the U.S.-backed Porfirio Diaz in 1911. But before he becomes president, he's actually going to write out a manifesto known as the Plan of San Luis Potosi. He writes it in San Antonio because he's been exiled for challenging the Diaz government. And in this Plan of San Luis Potosi, written on November 20th, 1910, from San Antonio, Texas, United States, he calls for all Mexicans to rise up against the dictator. Remember, the United States officially was back in the Diaz government. He was friendly to our business interests. And here you have an exiled Mexican living in the United States openly calling for a revolution. He is advocating for the overthrow of government leaders. And to many, this seemed as a hatred of democracy. Remember, Diaz was technically elected. Now, we know from history he's elected dictator, but he was elected. So you have Madero here who is openly calling for a revolution against an elected official. He is perceived as an anarchist, a hater of democracy. And the thing is, he's only a mild example. He was much more conservative than others, including El Partido Liberal Mexicano, the PLM. This was a major revolutionary group founded in 1905 by Ricardo Flores Magón. And Magón will use his publication, you see on your screen, Regeneración, to espouse a great deal of revolutionary ideals. He demonstrated openly. He agitated versus corruption. He was very anti-Diaz, yes, but also very anti-capitalist. He was critical of monopolies, critical of the super wealthy, critical of those who exploited the working class masses. He proposed labor reforms, regulation of big business, along with unionizations. He was seen as a freaking radical. He published a revolutionary newspaper that circulated in the United States called Regeneración, in which he condemned U.S. exploitation of both Mexicans and Mexican Americans. He condemns the U.S. support of the Diaz regime. The PLM also had activity that included some armed invasions of Mexico from U.S. soil. So he actually helped promote and lead small acts of banditry from the U.S. soil into Mexico. This was very problematic given the official policy of U.S. neutrality. He's viewed as a lawbreaker. And finally, in 1920, he'll be arrested and imprisoned on charges of conspiracy to invade a friendly nation from U.S. soil. In 1922, Magón will be sent to prison on charges of espionage, where he will mysteriously die. But here's the thing. Yes, there are examples like Madero. There are examples like Magon. But for the over 1 million Mexicans who would come into the United States during the Mexican Revolution, these so-called radicals were a very small, tiny percentage, a small minority. The majority of them are immigrants. They're refugees. They're seeking to flee these horrific conditions of warfare in their homeland. Yes, they seek new jobs in the United States. Yes, they want to reconstruct their transplanted lives. They tried to remain some pride in their home country, as well as their new host country, which is why the Spanish language newspapers we talked about last time were so important. They would create these little Mexicos. Again, Mexicano enclaves, barrios, that would form these ethnic enclaves in big cities. Now, these were common among all ethnic groups, going back to before the Gilded Age. But during the Mexican Revolution, increased radical stereotypes caused even more distrust as these fearful of being radical Mexicans were congregating in smaller areas. And this would lead to rampant discrimination in the Southwest, especially the Southwest. The bloody warfare, and especially Pancho Villa and Magon, would be used to create sensationalistic, yellow journalistic headlines in the U.S. newspapers. Look at some of the, ideas here. You have to picture that. These headlines are portraying the violence. We'll go back a couple slides here. You can see it here with Pancho Villa here. Oh, I backed up a little bit here, I know. But look at these headlines here. They really portray. So you have Villa massacres Americans, fleeing U.S. soldiers. These kind of headlines turn public opinion in the United States against not just Pancho Villa, but the Mexican people in general, who are then immigrating to the United States and forming in these little ethnic enclaves, little Mexicos. In the minds of Anglo-Americans, this cast all people of Mexican descent as suspect of being potentially engaged in brutal savagery, killing, attempting to overthrow governments. And the thing is, this wasn't just limited to the Southwest. Here's the North. Look at places like Michigan, where there is a substantial population by 1920 in a place called Mexican Town, an ethnic enclave. General John Pershing, who was the one who led the expedition to capture Pancho Villa and failed, he would return home to the Great Lakes region and would tell and recount very racist stories of his experiences in Mexico, where he, for some strange reason, was not welcomed by the Mexican people, who by and large supported Pancho Villa. And it was stories from General Pershing and from popular movies that would lead even Michigan U.S. representatives to testify that farmers in Michigan were, quote, led to believe that Mexicans were dangerous brigands who would harm their housewives, unquote. So you have the general who led the attack against Pancho Villa coming home and basically disparaging Mexican people. And here in Michigan, you have a bunch of migrant workers. And in Detroit, you have a Mexican town enclave. And many Anglos are thus viewing all Mexicans as violent, especially those in the North, because the reality is they have very little direct contact, historically speaking, with the Mexican community. And these feelings of mistrust of anarchists only intensified in 1914, 1915 as World War I breaks out. Now, there is overlap here with Mexico in a few minutes, but I want to spend a minute just so you understand what happened for the outbreak of World War I. You got to realize, to many Americans, the idea that civilized Europe could break into a world war was unreal. Europe had pretty much had seen about 100 years of peace ever since the fall of Napoleon in 1815. But that peace ended in 1914 when Austrian French Duke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. Now, here's the easy version. I'll give you the other rest of it in a minute. So what happens is the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand would be assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. And so as he's riding his car, the Serbian nationalist comes up and shoots him, kills him. In Austria-Hungary, big surprise, upset over this assassination, was determined to punish Serbia. And so it does declare war on Serbia. But that would actually make sense, right? This is what we expect when it comes to war. You killed our person, we go to war with you, right? This is fairly normal. But what happens next, though, is when Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia for the assassination, Serbia's ally, Russia, also begins to mobilize its army in support of Serbia. And the reason World War I breaks out here is because of what's called the alliance system. It was organized by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck as a way to ensure Germany's hegemony in Europe. And the alliance system had divided Europe into two major factions or two major blocks. And once the major countries began to mobilize for war, all the other countries began to do so as well. And it creates a chain reaction. So, bear with me. Get ready to hear this. Here's what happens. So, in 1914, Francis Ferdinand is assassinated. Austria-Hungary demarches against Serbia and cuts political ties. Russia begins war preparations because it's allies with Serbia. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia and only Serbia. Germany demands that Russia stop mobilizing or she will mobilize. The Russians refuse, and Germany and France both begin mobilizing. Germany declares war on Russia. The Ottomans and the Germans sign a secret alliance. Germany declares war on France because France declines neutrality. Germany invades Belgium. Britain declares war on Germany because her ally was Belgium. Austria-Hungary declares war on Russia, and Japan declares war on Germany due to a previous alliance with England. Whew. Oh, and by the way, this all takes place from June through August. This is a freaking summer vacation. And what it leads to is a divided Europe. Two sides that, due to alliances, are now all at war with one another. And it's the Triple Alliance, the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Italy, versus the Triple Entente, which are Britain, France, Russia, Romania, Serbia, and later Italy switches sides, and then later the United States. This is the beginning of World War I, and it is a horrific war. It was unlike any previous war in history, both in scope and carnage. The reason for this, though, was because because military tactics had not kept up with modern military technology. Because now you've got machine guns that don't misfire. You have high-velocity rifles, aerial bombings, poison gas, flamethrowers, landmines, long-range artillery, armored tanks. But they still rely on old-fashioned stand in front of each other and shoot. Now, when this didn't work, they quickly engaged in what's called trench warfare. Dig massive ditches and wait for your enemy and eventually die of starvation and disease. The result was massive casualties and widespread destruction. Over 61 million men will serve in the armed forces on both sides of the conflict. Over 9 million people die. Another 19 million are wounded. life in the trenches was miserable and dangerous. And as casualties mounted, many Americans were shocked. Most couldn't even find Serbia on the map, and very few were prepared to go to war in its defense. Now, public opinion-wise, we said we wanted England to win, but we were basically neutral. And Woodrow Wilson, for his part, remained neutral and resisted entering the war, including declaring neutrality in 1914. He saw this as an opportunity once again, that a neutral America could play a leading role in moral diplomacy and world peace after the war. We should stay out of the war and build a new world order afterward. Selfish nationalism would give way to cooperative internationalism. Nations would join hand to hand and sing Kumbaya. Remember, he's an idealist. He strongly believed in America's leadership on the world stage. But this plan hinged on the U.S. being neutral. And again, much like moral diplomacy with the Mexican Revolution, this is much more difficult to put into practice. And again, initially, we're concerned with the Mexican Revolution in Pancho Villa. Unfortunately, though, within a couple of years, it becomes pretty clear we can't stay neutral. In 1915, a U.S. ship was sunk. 1,200 people died, sunk by the German submarines known as U-boats. The Lusitania's sinking in 1915 put us on the brink of war. Now, Germans claim that the U.S. was secretly transporting war supplies for England with using humans as shields, which we kind of were. But, nonetheless, Wilson still avoided war, basically saying, hey, Germany, don't ever do that again. If you do, we'll be at war. And Germany agreed to it. We stayed out of the war a couple more years. But by 1917, the war was going badly for Germany. Germany was in trouble. And they made them throw 3 Hail Marys. I know it's a football term, from in the football games or halftime. But Germany makes 3 Hail Marys. Number 1, they resumed unrestricted U-boat warfare in violation of their promise to Wilson, hoping that Wilson would, not live up to that promise to enter war. And we were temporarily delayed in this. Hail Mary number 2, get Russia out of the war. And so what Germany planned to do here was they went into Switzerland and promised Vladimir Lenin safe passage across Germany to help him return to Russia and overthrow the government of Russia. So Germany went into neutral Switzerland, helped get Lenin, took him across Germany through Sweden back into Russia, with the hope that he would lead a communist revolution in Russia. It worked. And in response, Vladimir Lenin pulled Russia out of the war. This worked for Germany, one less person to fight. But Hail Mary number 3. Remember that unrestricted U-boat warfare, hoping to keep the U.S. out of war, or hoping that the U.S. would not join the war despite the U-boat warfare? Well, to prevent the U.S. from joining the war, Hail Mary number 3 was what's called the Zimmerman note. There was a Zimmerman telegram. So this was a telegram in 1917 that was intercepted by the British forces that was being sent from Germany to Mexico. Germany was asking Mexico to join the war and promised that they would support Mexico if they would attack the United States. Let me repeat that. They sent a telegram to Mexico imploring Mexico to attack the United States, to join the war on their side and attack the United States. Germany in turn promised that they would not only supply guns and ammunition, but after the war is over and they win, they would restore the U.S. Southwest to Mexico. Now, ultimately, Mexico says no. Now, be clear, they're in no position, given the Mexican Revolution, to do this. So they wisely declined. In addition, the British intercepted the telegram and gave it to the United States. Wilson was furious. He released the telegram to the American press. And yet, Wilson still would not declare war. And yeah, it would cause major U.S.-Mexican relations. It would cause major problems for Mexican and Mexican-American communities throughout the United States, who are already having a hard time proving their loyalty to the United States during a war. Now, this is what most history classes teach as the entrance to the war. And that all plays a part. But I want to proffer one other reason, and that is economic reasons. It's money that pulls the United States into war in 1917. The U.S. had loaned over $300 million to England, over $350 million to France, and $70 million to Russia. This is not the U.S. government, this is Wall Street. These economic ties to the Allied powers, the Triple Entente, was the greatest barrier against American neutrality. Yeah, we say we're going to war to prevent tyranny, or in response to the Zimmerman telegram, or response to unrestricted U-boat warfare. But the reality is, three of the wealthiest men in America, J.P. Morgan, Chase Bank, George Baker, First National Bank, and James Stillman, railroad tycoon, three of the most wealthy, powerful bankers in the United States, controlled Wall Street. And part of the major reason we declare war in 1917 on the Central Powers was to protect their financial interest, much like had been done by going into Mexico. Because these men had been secretly funding the Allied powers. And the defeat of the Allied powers means their collapse, which also means financial collapse for the United States. And thus the U.S. will finally declare war. The U.S. was now at war abroad. And while the influx of U.S. troops would indeed give the injection needed to finish off the Germans, it was not a popular war among the American people. Most soldiers would be drafted under the Selective Service Act of 1917, requiring all men aged 21 to 30 to register for military service. But it works. The U.S. injection of troops will finally finish off the Germans. And in 1918, just 1 year later, the First World War is over. It'll be ended by the Treaty of Versailles. That will be dominated by the Allied powers. Now, the major author of this is the United States. England and France get all the spoils of war. Russia gets nothing because they left the war in 1917. But more importantly, it forces Germany to take full responsibility for the war. Forces them to pay heavy reparations, heavy fines. Forces Germany to disarm, to get rid of the weapons and their army. It also redraws the map of Europe. And the thing is, when they redrew the map of Europe, they didn't take into account historic borders. They didn't take into account ethno-racial groups. They just drew lines on a map, however they wanted. And it would create long-standing hostilities with the United States, as many of those people in those regions would suffer greatly, blaming the United States for their problems. But the United States is going to have ongoing unrest and upheaval on the home front as well, both during and after the war. And that's where we will turn our attention next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.